This podcast is brought to you by Most Valuable Podcasts, leading the league in podcasting entertainment.
What's up, Real MVPs, Ricky Widmer here, along with the one, the only, Brandon Swanson.
Hey.
And we are back for another edition of the Primetime Podcast right here on Most Valuable Podcast, where we usually talk about the best in college football and college basketball. Going to be starting soon to kind of have to be able to mix the two, as basketball is just around the corner. However, we are in a full football mode. As Brandon, before I get into the usual way I start this podcast, what about all the upsets and all the crazy games that we had this past week?
It was nuts. Actually, I think that they said if you put down a parlay on a number of underdogs against teams, and I think it was in the Pac-12, if you put down a $100 parlay on like these 5 games on those underdogs, you would have gotten $170,000.
What? $170,000?
Yeah.
Whoa, I gotta start gambling. Maybe that's the way I get out of my debt. I just start gambling on these college football games now that it's actually okay to do so.
Debt, though, Ricky.
Yeah, well, that's
the way you get into debt.
Knowing me, I'd win some, but I would lose quite a bit. But if you haven't noticed, Brandon on the phone again this week, so we're doing a phoner. It's both audio on YouTube and now on all the podcast services we're on around the world. Before we get into what we're going to talk about, I'll do the housekeeping first. Make sure to check out patreon.com/mostvaluablepodcast. That's how you can support us. If you join us at the $10 tier, each and every month you support us at the $10 tier, you can join a podcast. You can come on a Primetime Podcast and talk about whatever you want to talk about. You can do so down below in the description. You can also support us by getting yourself an MVP t-shirt showing off the logo, showing off the brand MVP. You can also get that at mostvaluablepodcast.com, where you can also catch MVP each and every day. And then last but not least, make sure to go on to iTunes and Apple Podcasts. We have not gotten a new rating since October 10th. But please go on to iTunes and Apple Podcasts. Let us know why you like listening to the podcast. Give us whatever rating you think we deserve, but I hope you're giving us a 5-star rating. But Brandon, jam-packed show today. We're going to start with a little college football playoff. We are recording this on the eve of the first rankings for the college football playoff season for 2018. We're going to take a look at 2 specific conferences, the Big 12 and the Pac-12, to see if they are still alive. Then we're going to dive into 2 specific games. We've got Alabama-LSU this weekend. Will it be a great game? The LSU Tigers, I think, are a 14.5-point underdog, and they are at home against Alabama. And then we got a big game in the Big 10 where we got Penn State going up against Michigan. Can the Wolverines avoid an upset to the hands of the Penn State Nittany Lions? We will dive into that. And then at the end of the podcast, we will go ahead and make our picks for week number 10 in college football. But the first topic we will get into, college football playoff. The picture is still not yet clear because there's 3 undefeateds at the top who will most likely be in 1, 2, and 3. And then there's a slew of just one-loss teams. And I'm going to throw UCF out there before those fans get mad. You guys are undefeated, but you guys will probably not be in the top 4 of the college football rankings this week. Then there's a slew of one-loss teams. And the 2 I want to look at are Oklahoma and Washington State. Because with Texas losing to West Virginia, or not to West Virginia, they play West Virginia this week, losing to Oklahoma State this past week, Oklahoma now looks like they may be, I know West Virginia's still in there, but we could throw both of them in there, but Oklahoma looks to be right now the favorite to get into the college football playoff from the Big 12. They only have that 1 loss to Texas, and Washington State seems like the only team that might have a little bit of a chance to even crack the playoff from the Pac-12. They have a lone loss to USC earlier in the year when they lost 39-36. I want to just ask you, Brandon, to start everything off. Is looking at everything, and I know it's still early, but each week we get a little bit more answers. Do you think at this point the Big 12 and the Pac-12 are still alive when it comes to the college football playoff?
I think that certainly when you look at both of those, the one that I would say more so has a chance is going to be the Big 12. There's bigger games remaining on the schedules for those teams. For if you're looking at an Oklahoma, they still have to play the West Virginia Mountaineers at the end of the season. West Virginia, they have Texas this weekend, and then of course they have Oklahoma. I think that is why I would look at the Big 12 and say that there's more of an opportunity if you're comparing Big 12 and Pac-12 for the Big 12 to have a chance. While Washington State has looked really good and they have won some big games, especially their last four. They've won 4 in a row, beating Utah, a good team, the best team on the other side, in the Pac-12 South. Then you've got they beat Oregon State as most teams should. You beat Oregon, and then you win on the road at Stanford by 3 points this past weekend. But for Washington State, the remaining schedule isn't terribly strong, or as strong as the Big 12 schedule.
Yeah,
they've got Colorado on the road, they've got Arizona, they've got Washington, and now you got a Cal team who just beat Washington. They're beating a Washington team who is not a Washington team we've seen in the past. I mean, Jake Browning, things were so bad he got benched. Then you've got a Colorado team who's been up and down this season, and then you have an Arizona team that's the same way, up and down, but who had a huge week this past weekend against Oregon. Where did that come from? A 44-point explosion against this Oregon team. So Washington State, while I think that they're very much alive because they're 7-1, they've been playing well, and the rest of their schedule doesn't prove to be terribly difficult, that could be one thing that hurts them. The Big 12, they're alive. They have just one loss. You look at Oklahoma and you look at West Virginia, but the rest of their schedule, West Virginia has 2 more ranked games, and then you've got Oklahoma, who has at least 1 ranked game. So that's where I think if you look at the two, you compare them, it's a little bit more in play for the Big 12 than it is for the Pac-12 right now.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. Right now, it looks like the only way, I'll say this, the only way the Pac-12 has a shot at getting into the playoff is if Washington wins its next 4 games and then beats either, right now it would be number 16 Utah, but anything can happen. You've got really every other team after Utah in the south of the Pac-12. They have 3 losses. So really if Utah loses 1 game, everyone then has 3 losses right now in that side of the conference, whereas Washington State, it's probably going to come down to, if they win their next 3, it'll come down to potentially that Washington game to see if they can get into the Pac-12 title game from the north. That's the only way the Pac-12 is getting in, is if Washington State wins their next 4, gets that 5th game, and then wins that 5th game in the Pac-12 title game. With the Big 12, it's a little bit more feasible. Like you had mentioned, you got West Virginia. They have 2 ranked opponents left. However, I will say they do have, and we will be picking this game because West Virginia will probably be ranked at this, but November 17th, they do go into Oklahoma State, so we'll have to see who Brandon picks.
I'll be withholding from that one. I'll be abstaining from that pick.
And then we will see who wins because I can't make a pick unless I know who Brandon thinks is going to win. And like when I look at the standings for the Big 12, really it comes down to like Texas needs a win this week. Them losing to Oklahoma State obviously was not good, but they need a win just because, all right, they've already after this week will have played West Virginia, will have played Oklahoma. Then, like you mentioned, Oklahoma and West Virginia already have played each other. And Oklahoma, they're already behind the 8 ball because they lost to Texas in their rivalry game. And West Virginia is the easiest. They win both of them, and they go ahead and they go on and be the top team in the Big 12. The only question is who's going to be that second team. And I feel like Texas, we're not talking about them. They're kind of behind the 8 ball because they can just win out and be the number 1 seed in the Big 12 still. But Oklahoma, they're that team that although they are 7th in the rankings, to me, they are behind the 8 ball because even if West Virginia beats Texas and then then West Virginia goes on and beats Oklahoma, because Oklahoma lost that Red River rivalry game, they would then be behind Texas and not get that Big 12 title shot. However, you could possibly say, well, Ricky, if they lose to West Virginia, that's where their playoff shot loses. It's there, not the fact that they wouldn't get a Big 10 title game.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that if they lose to West Virginia on November 23rd, that last game of the regular season, I think if they lose to West Virginia there, it's kind of all said and done for them. Mm-hmm. They're just kind of dead in the water at that point. I think, and this is an interesting conversation to talk about, Big 12 and Pac-12. But the bigger thing even from this is, do either of them even have a chance? Because many people would say right now that the fourth team, because I think right now it would be safe to say, as of what we've seen through, 8 weeks, mm-hmm. is going to be the fact that they've got Alabama at 1, Clemson at 2, Notre Dame at 3, and a toss-up at number 4. So right now everyone's fighting for that number 4 spot. Mm-hmm. Everyone's fighting for that number 4 spot right now, and a lot of people would say it's still in the hands of the Big Ten, and it could be. Mm-hmm. It very well could be. Michigan is still very much alive over there. Penn State stayed somewhat alive. Ohio State was on a bye this week, but they're still alive, and they still have a big matchup with Michigan. Michigan plays Penn State this weekend. That's going to be a really big game for Michigan. If Penn State loses, they're completely done. If Michigan loses, they're in a worse spot, and then it really comes down to that last game against Ohio State. Mm-hmm. But that's where I think a lot of people still believe that it's alive in the hands of the Big Ten for that final spot as we look at the playoff scenario right now.
Well, and I'm about to either make you angry, but also I'm going to throw this out there because it may very well happen. In the SEC and the Big Ten, there are a slew of one-loss teams. We got LSU with 1 loss, Georgia with 1 loss, Kentucky with 1 loss, and then all the Big Ten teams you mentioned, Michigan and Ohio State. But then there's also like Florida and Penn State who have the 2 losses. If you look at this weekend, Alabama plays LSU. Let's say the favorite wins. Alabama wins. LSU is now at 2 losses. Let's say Kentucky, Georgia, pick a winner in that one. Doesn't matter. The other one lost. Okay, that's another team at 2 losses. Then Penn State, if they're able to beat Michigan, Michigan is now at 2 losses with Penn State, who's also at 2 losses. Then later on in the year, SEC title game. Let's say Alabama rolls on through, no pun intended, and they beat the winner of this Georgia-Kentucky game. All right, that Georgia-Kentucky game, that team now has 2 losses. And then if Michigan beats Ohio State, I know there's a lot of ifs here, but just roll with me. Michigan then beats Ohio State. That is another team with 2 losses. And then it comes down to what is going on in the Big 12, what is going on in the Pac-12, but then also I'm going to say it. I know a lot of this needs to happen, a lot of what ifs, but if these teams moving forward just beat each other up, like a Penn State beats Michigan up this week and wins, but then Michigan goes ahead and beats Ohio State, if we get a ton of 2-loss teams, that could then open the door for a West Virginia, for an Oklahoma, for a Washington State, who might not have the rest of the schedule be the toughest, but they would only have 1 loss. They would have that conference championship. And also, you could throw in there, because they are high enough in the rankings this year, if enough of these 1-loss teams get knocked down into 2 losses, that might even open the door for a UCF to be in the playoff discussion at the end of the year?
It possibly could. That's where these next couple of games are going to really start to clear up the picture that we're looking at here for the playoffs. It'll get really crazy if an Alabama, a Clemson, or a Notre Dame are to lose, because then we're looking at, okay, well, especially Notre Dame. If Notre Dame loses one game, things get very difficult for them. But they've been taking care of business and doing it pretty well lately. So that's good, certainly on their end. But if an Alabama falls over there in the SEC, that makes things really interesting. And LSU were to win. But the way that things are, and the way that we can believe that Alabama most likely wins out, Clemson most likely wins out, Notre Dame most likely same thing as of right now. But it's that fourth team. It is that fourth team. And right now, I don't necessarily see it happening. But if all these teams are beating up on each other, and you come up with a number of 2-loss teams, and you still have UCF sitting there at a perfect record, when do you say, okay, well, we have to at least put them into the discussion. We have to at least put them into the discussion to, go through and, okay, look back at their schedule, look at, all of those types of things. But that's where they could be heard. That's where they could be heard of. And we've said it time and time again of, did they have a strong enough schedule? And then people who are UCF fans certainly will say, well, did, teams like, people have used Alabama. Alabama's a bad scenario for this one because if they win out, they're certainly going to be in. People will say, well, yeah, Alabama has a tough schedule, but look at some of the cupcake games that they put in there against the Citadel or, whatever have you. And that's an easy game. That's an easy game. That's an easier game than the teams that UCF is playing every single week. And Alabama fits about 3 of those in on their schedule. So then UCF fans would say, well, how is that fair? We're at least playing a balanced schedule of maybe not the toughest teams, but we aren't going all the way down to the Citadel, of that level to play them. So that's where, there's the argument that you can make for both sides there. But it really, to me, it's going to be right now the one that I'm interested in that Big Ten and what they do and what happens in this game for Michigan this weekend. Because if Michigan loses to Penn State, that puts Penn State at 4-2 in the conference. Michigan at a 5-1. Ohio State most likely would get a win this weekend, and that would put them to 5-1 because they're playing Nebraska. If they lost there, I would be. They should probably just fire, their head coach Urban Meyer at that point. But I don't see that happening. But then that puts Michigan at 5-1 and Ohio State at 5-1, and both of those teams really battling for that final game. In that final game of 2 5-1 teams, one of them would most likely be not 6-1, but have only one loss at the very end there. So that could be the thing that helps them the most. And then Ohio State, if they were to win, they have just a 1 loss overall with everything. And Michigan would have, a loss and, possibly 2, and then 2 losses overall. So that's where I think Ohio State is still very much alive in this thing for the Big Ten.
And it's going to be, of course, for the 2 conferences, it's going to clear up because, like, for example, this weekend, Georgia and Kentucky are playing each other. Michigan and Penn State are playing each other. One of those teams has to win. One of those teams has to lose unless they tie. But in college football, you don't have the tie. You play the overtime until you get a win. It's not like the NFL where, overtime's over. You went ahead and tied the game. Last thing I want to ask you before we move on into the 2 games we're going to talk about. So we're recording this on Monday night. Tomorrow will be the first college football playoff rankings that we get for this season. it's pretty sure that Alabama, Clemson, and Notre Dame, in some order, will be the top 3 teams. Brandon, I will ask you first, just to end the segment. If you were the committee, the Brandon Swanson committee, what is your top 4 and then your first 2 out? So your top 6 teams in your playoff rankings this week.
So if it were me, the 4 playoff teams would be Alabama at 1, Clemson at 2, Notre Dame at 3, and then at number 4 I'd have the Michigan Wolverines as of how we stand with things right now. And then my first 2 teams out would probably be Oklahoma and Washington State.
You actually shocked me with that Michigan one because I thought I was going to be bold. So here's what I'm thinking. First off, when I look at the top 3 and I look at all the undefeateds, the only ranked team Alabama has played is Texas A&M. The only ranked opponent that Clemson has beaten is NC State. The only ranked opponents then Notre Dame has beaten, Michigan to start the year, Stanford, and Virginia Tech. I know that Virginia Tech was 24, and they didn't have their starting quarterback. I am going to be bold here, and this is how the first ones should be. My top 4 is going to be Notre Dame at number 1. The reason being, they have played more ranked opponents, and they have beaten those ranked opponents. Then at number 2, Alabama, because they've just cruised this year. And at number 3, Clemson, because they have also cruised this year, except for that game against Syracuse. Then at number 4, my decision for 4 was either LSU or Michigan. And this is why I'm going to choose Michigan, because their only loss came against Notre Dame, who is now, to me, in mine, the number 1 team in my playoff rankings. And their ranked wins are against Wisconsin, who I know now is unranked, and Michigan State. LSU, yes, they had beaten the number 2 team in Georgia. Yes, they've beaten Mississippi State. But Auburn, who they beat by 1, isn't the Auburn we thought. They're not even ranked. Miami isn't the team that we thought they were going to be when they were ranked 8th to start the year. So those opponents have kind of become lesser than what they thought we would be. That's why I would go Michigan at 4. So my playoff matchups would be Notre Dame, Michigan again, and then Alabama, Clemson. And then my first 2 out right now, I think it would have to be LSU and Georgia because of just how close we are to that Ohio State loss. So I'm going to shake things up a little bit with Notre Dame at 1, but also LSU and Georgia being the 5 and the 6 teams of first out. Before we move on, do you have any reaction to either my top 4 or anything that we did not mention in this discussion?
I think that your top 4, it's interesting with having Notre Dame there at number 1. It certainly makes sense, but what I always think is I think a lot of the times the committee they do not go too far. They do not stray too far from the path that the AP top 25 poll kind of has there for them. Mm-hmm. Most likely a lot of the time you're going to have, if, these top 4 teams are, AP top 4 teams, a lot of the time you're getting at least 3 of those teams that are going to be or start as playoff teams. Mm-hmm. I think that I just don't see them moving anything with those top 3, with Alabama, Clemson, and then Notre Dame. I just don't see them moving them, even with Notre Dame possibly having, better wins against opponents. I think they're going to keep it the way it is, and I think they'll also say that it's the way that Clemson beats opponents. It's the way that Alabama has beat opponents, where the teams just aren't even in the games. I mean, this is outside of conference play, inside conference play. They just most of the games aren't very close. They're blowing out teams. Things are done pretty much in the first half. It's over, and a lot of times by the first quarter. So that's why I don't think that they'll stray much from those first three teams. With that fourth one always kind of being that toss-up, especially at the beginning. And then once we have these next couple of weeks that we play, things will become a little bit more clear. So that's why I think it's interesting that you have Notre Dame there at number one, and maybe that is the right move to do if you want to get a legitimate, who has been the best team in terms of how you started the season, the teams that you've played, the way that you've beaten them, the strength of your schedule, this, that, and the other thing. And those are all the things that, the committee is always supposed to take in mind. But, I think that they're not going to go too far from, okay, these are the best. These have been the best teams all year. We're not going to change them from the ladder that they're on right now.
Well, and I thought about today before the podcast. This was early in the morning when I was taking my shower that, hey, you know what? We haven't talked about Alabama much this year, and it's kind of the same thing that we talk about on the NBA side of the things in the fast break, is that once a team hits greatness like Alabama has, it's just not fun to talk about. And it's like, that's why you get the stuff with Alabama and Nick Saban being mad that fans aren't coming to the game. It's just, when the team's this good, it's like, all right, we know they're going to roll, and there's no conversation there. So that's why the committee will probably do what you said and just keep it in order. But yet again, I find it interesting that it's like, hey, you know what? Notre Dame, they're going out there and playing more ranked opponents than the other two. But we're going to get into Alabama LSU next. Before we do, this is where you guys come in. Let us know what you think down below in the comment section. What would be your playoff rankings? If you're listening to this after Tuesday, what do you think of the playoff rankings? And also, what do you think for the Big 12 and the Pac-12? Are they still alive when it comes to the college football playoff?